You are just trash, Mom. Why do not you just rot here?" Those cruel words from Ethan felt like a knife through the heart on Annette's 72nd birthday. Stripped of everything from her phone to her late husband's last keepsake. Annette realized she had not just lost her freedom, she had lost her only son to a monster of pure greed. Hello, everyone. I am Casey. It is so good to be back with you in this cozy little space. Today, I want to share a story with you. It is a story about shattered trust and how one woman rose from the ashes of betrayal. This is the story of Annette, a mother who spent her whole life building strong foundations, only to watch her own home crumble under the weight of her only son's greed. Let us listen to her words full of pain, yet deeply resilient, as she tells her story. That morning, my kitchen was filled with the sweet, comforting scent of pancakes and maple syrup. I had woken up early, humming to myself as I put on my favorite floral dress, feeling a flutter of excitement in my chest like a young girl. It was my 72nd birthday, a milestone I wanted to celebrate with the person who mattered most. I sat by the bay window, watching the morning mist cling to the leaves of the old oak tree in my front yard, here in the quiet suburbs of Atlanta. When the doorbell finally rang, my heart leaped. It was Ethan. My son walked in with a smile that I took for warmth, the kind of smile that makes a mother believe everything is right in the world. He told me he had a special birthday surprise and wanted to take me somewhere I truly deserved to be. I believed him. I climbed into his polished Mercedes, thinking that after all the years of distance since he took over his father's engineering firm, we were finally going to heal. As we drove through the familiar streets, I felt a surge of pride, pointing out the old bridge projects I had helped design decades ago. But Ethan was silent. His fingers tapped a restless, impatient rhythm on the steering wheel. When I tried to share a memory, he snapped at me, saying he preferred the silence. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off, telling myself he was just stressed from work. The car eventually pulled up to a grand but cold red brick building with a sign that read, "The Pines." Before I could even process where we were, Ethan was out of the car, rounding the side to open my door with a sudden, rough jerk. He grabbed my arm so tightly I felt my brittle bones groan under the pressure. He told me this was my new home. I froze, my eyes wide as I stared at the heavy, locked iron gates. I told him I didn't want to be there, that this was a nursing home, but he didn't listen. He dragged me through the sterile, chilly hallways while the sharp smell of antiseptic made my stomach churn. Ethan leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive coffee, but his voice sounding like ice. He told me to stop making a scene, calling me nothing but outdated trash and telling me to rot there so he could move on with his life. With a cruel finality, he wrenched my purse and phone from my hands, even stripping the heirloom watch my husband gave me from my wrist. The world turned dark around the edges. My legs gave out, and I sank onto the freezing floor, my ears ringing with the sound of my own son's mocking laughter as he turned his back on me. The sound of that door clicking shut was a dry, hollow thud that felt like the final period at the end of a long sentence. I stood in the middle of a room so white it hurt my eyes, the harsh, clinical scent of bleach completely erasing the last lingering traces of the maple syrup from my birthday breakfast. My arm throbbed with a dull heat, a physical reminder of the way Ethan had gripped me. I could already see the faint, reddish-purple outline of his fingers beginning to bloom on my skin. I did not cry. I think some pains are just too deep for tears, like a structural crack in a foundation that you do not see until the whole building starts to lean dangerously to one side. I sat on the edge of the narrow, stiff bed, my fingers instinctively reaching for my wrist, only to find the bare skin where my husband's watch had been just minutes ago. That empty space pulled my mind back 30 years, away from this prison and back to the sun-drenched, dusty construction sites of Atlanta. Back then, I was a rarity. I was one of the very few women of color standing among heavy machinery and men in hard hats fighting for every inch of respect I earned as a structural engineer. I remembered the grit in my teeth and the way the blueprints would flutter in the wind. But I had done it all for him. Every drop of sweat, every late night spent calculating load-bearing weights and stress points was a brick in the future I was building for Ethan. I could still feel the weight of the pen in my hand the day I signed that $150,000 check for his Ivy League tuition. It was every cent my late husband and I had painstakingly saved, but I had never felt wealthier or more proud. I truly believed I was raising a man of integrity who would honor his father's legacy. But as I sat in that suffocating silence, the cracks I had tried so hard to ignore finally became clear. I remembered the way Ethan would roll his eyes with such irritation whenever I spoke about the physical labor it took to build our life. I remembered the cold, predatory look in his eyes whenever I refused to sell the commercial properties his father had left to me. To him, I was no longer the woman who had carried him and built his world. I was just a nuisance, a barrier standing between him and a multi-million-dollar inheritance. He called me outdated trash. Those words played over and over in my head like a broken record. He had not just snapped today. He had planned this. He had whispered lies to doctors, manufactured a story about my mind failing me, and paved his way with bribes just to erase my existence and take what was mine. The bitterness was a physical weight in my chest, but beneath it, the mind of an engineer began to stir. If Ethan thought I was a failed blueprint to be discarded, he was dead wrong. I have spent my entire life building structures meant to withstand the fiercest Georgia storms, and I am not about to let this one knock me down. I need to be calm. I need to watch and listen to the rhythm of this place. There has to be a way to reach the world outside these walls and prove that Annette Carter is still here, and her mind is as sharp as the day she designed her first bridge. The first night at the Pines stretched on like an endless century. I sat huddled on the edge of the stiff bed, staring at the dark patterns of the ceiling, while the cold air of the facility seeped into my bones. Every problem-solving skill I had mastered as a structural engineer felt frozen by the calculated cruelty of my own son. But then, a soft knock at dawn broke the silence. A man in a dark suit entered, holding a thick manila file. When his eyes met mine, I saw a familiar spark. He whispered my name with disbelief, and I realized it was Jacob Miller. He was my dear friend of 43 years, someone who had known my late husband and me since we were young. Jake was now the director of this entire facility. He looked at me with shock, asking why I was in an isolation ward. He told me that according to the paperwork Ethan submitted, I was suffering from late-stage Alzheimer's and had become dangerously violent. My heart turned to lead. Ethan had not just imprisoned me, he had tried to erase my sanity and my identity. I gripped Jake's hand, my voice steady despite my fear. I told him to look me in the eye and to see that I was perfectly fine. I explained how Ethan had lured me here on my birthday, how he had stolen my phone, my wallet, and my husband's heirloom watch to gain total control of my estate. Jake grew silent, his jaw tight with anger. He looked through the forged documents, admitting that Ethan had been meticulous. However, Ethan had made one fatal mistake. He did not know his mother had a loyal friend in charge of this place. Jake told me I was safe now. He moved me to a private suite, away from the staff Ethan had tried to manipulate. He pressed a small phone into my hand and promised to contact my lawyer, Evan Shaw. For the first time, I felt warmth returning to my chest. I was not alone. My strategic mind began to whir back to life. Ethan thought he had built a perfect cage, but he forgot that I was the one who taught him how to analyze structures. Now, I am going to find the deepest crack in his foundation of lies. We just heard a spark of hope for Annette. Even in the darkest times, life can offer a helping hand. If your own child betrayed you to take your savings, what would you feel first? Anger or heartbreak? Have you ever felt more love from friends than family? Share your thoughts below. The new room Jake arranged for me sat at the very end of the hallway, a quiet sanctuary with a wide window that looked out over a garden filled with blooming magnolia trees. In any other circumstance, the sight of those waxy white petals and the soft Georgia breeze would have been a comfort. But the luxury of this private suite did not calm the storm brewing in my mind. The small burner phone Jake had slipped to me felt heavy in my palm, pulsing with a heat that reminded me of a glowing coal. I knew that once I pressed the button to call Evan Shaw, my life would never be the same. The bridge to my past was already crumbling, and the truth that was about to be revealed would likely be more devastating than any structural failure I had ever inspected in my career as an engineer. I took a deep breath, the scent of antiseptic still clinging to my skin, and waited for the man I once called my son to be unmasked. A few hours later, Jake returned with a laptop tucked under his arm and a look on his face that was grimmer than I had ever seen. He closed the door firmly, drawing the heavy curtains to block out the world before sitting down across from me. He spoke in a low voice, telling me he had asked Evan to perform a preliminary remote audit of my accounts. I held my breath as he turned the screen toward me, displaying rows of numbers and transaction histories that looked like a foreign language to most, but were as clear as a blueprint to me. To an engineer, numbers do not lie. They are the load-bearing pillars of reality. But as I scrolled through the screen, I saw nothing but cracks and rot. Jake pointed to a recent transaction from just yesterday. Ethan had sold my Mercedes-Benz to a used car dealership on the outskirts of town, pocketing $15,400 in cash instantly. My heart gave a sharp, painful throb. That car was the last gift my husband bought for me before he passed. It was not just a vehicle. It was a vessel for our memories, the last place I could still smell his cologne. Evan Shaw, the lawyer who had stood by my family for over 22 years, joined us via the speakerphone. His voice was deep and professional, yet it vibrated with a suppressed fury. He told me that Ethan had filed a comprehensive power of attorney document with my bank. Evan had secured a digital copy and explained that while the signature looked identical to mine at a glance, the connecting strokes were too perfect. They lacked the natural, slight tremor of a 72-year-old hand and looked as though they had been rendered by a machine. Ethan had forged my name to seize control of my entire estate, a legacy worth over $1.3 million. I felt as though the air had been kicked out of my lungs. The boy I had held in my arms, the child I had taught to hold a pencil, had used those same hands to sign my name and effectively erase my right to my own life. I asked Evan what else he had found, bracing myself for the impact. Evan hesitated for a moment before delivering the most heartbreaking news of all. The 529 college savings account that my husband and I had established specifically for our granddaughter Sarah's education had been completely drained. $48,000 were gone. Ethan had used the excuse of emergency medical expenses for my care to justify the withdrawal. He was not just stealing from me, he was robbing his own daughter of her future. I stood up abruptly, my knees shaking so hard I had to grip the back of a chair to stay upright. Sarah was my greatest hope. She had just started her freshman year as a psychology major, full of dreams and light. Ethan knew that money was sacred, protected by his father's final wishes. Yet, his greed had turned him into a stranger, someone willing to crush his own child's aspirations for the sake of a few more digits in his bank balance. "There is more," Jake added, his voice hardening. "Evan found a pending contract for one of my commercial properties downtown." Ethan was actively soliciting buyers and had already accepted a deposit for a sale expected to close within the week. The property was valued at nearly $500,000. If we did not move now, the entire foundation my husband and I had built over 40 years of hard labor would vanish like smoke. A wave of pure disgust rose in my throat. I looked down at my hands, the skin weathered and calloused from years of walking job sites and laying the groundwork for our family. Ethan called me trash, yet he was starving for every drop of sweat that trash had ever shed. He wanted me to rot in this facility, not because he cared for my health, but because he needed me out of the way so he could scrub my existence from the world. The initial paralyzing pain was slowly being replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. My mind, trained to solve the most complex of problems, began to whir back to life. I realized I could not afford to simply sit here and weep for the son I thought I knew. When a structure is failing, a good engineer does not panic. She finds the critical pressure points to reinforce, or she begins the process of removing the decayed parts to save the whole. I looked at Jake, and then at the phone still connected to Evan. I told Evan I wanted every single piece of evidence gathered. Every forged check, every bank recording, and every bill of sale. I told Jake I needed him to help me keep my awareness a secret. Ethan needed to believe I was still just a confused, broken old woman locked away in a room. I took a long, deep breath, feeling a new kind of strength flowing through my veins. Ethan thinks he has won because he is younger and more ruthless, but he forgot who built the world he is trying to steal. If he wants a fight over the legacy of this family, I'm going to show him exactly what happens when you try to tear down a foundation built on the truth. After Jake left, the room fell into a silence that was almost terrifying. The Georgia moonlight filtered through the pine needles outside my window, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor that looked like cracks in a dry riverbed. I looked down at the small phone in my hand, the only bridge left between me and the truth, and it felt as heavy as a lead weight. The numbers Evan Shaw had just recited were still swirling in my mind like a chaotic storm. $1.3 million, $48,000 from Sarah's college fund, and the missing Mercedes. Everything I had spent 40 years of my life building was being hollowed out from the inside by my own flesh and blood. I closed my eyes, and my mind drifted back to the early days when Ethan was small. I could almost smell the sweet scent of baby powder on his skin and feel the way his tiny, warm hand gripped my finger as he took his first shaky steps on the green grass of our backyard. As an engineer, I have always known how to reinforce the weakest points of a structure. When Ethan struggled in school, I was there to shore him up. When he needed capital to keep his father's firm afloat, I signed the checks without a moment's hesitation, never once questioning his intent. I had always believed that a mother's unconditional love was the strongest adhesive, the permanent bond that would keep this family from ever falling apart. But now, In this cold and sterile room, I have to ask myself a question that cuts deeper than any knife. Has my protection all these years actually been a form of neglect? By shielding him from every failure, was I merely enabling the rot in his soul to grow unchecked? Those words he spat at me, calling me trash and telling me to rot, were not just a momentary lapse in judgment. They were the result of a moral structure that had been leaning dangerously for a long time, and I was too blinded by love to see the tilt. If I continue to stay silent now, if I allow him to steal Sarah's future and erase our legacy, I am not just losing money. I am losing the very honor of the Carter name. A good engineer never tries to hide a major structural failure with a fresh coat of paint. They have to be brave enough to demolish the damaged parts to save the foundation. I realize now that loving Ethan in this moment does not mean protecting him from the law. It means forcing him to face the consequences of his own choices. This is not a journey of revenge, but a necessary restoration of justice. Ethan needs to understand that while money can build skyscrapers, deception will eventually bring down a whole life. I took a deep breath, feeling the trembles in my heart finally go still, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. I will not break. I will not let the greed of my son and his wife Natalie erase the values my husband and I lived for. Tonight, I am no longer just a discarded mother. I am Annette Carter, and I am starting the process of shoring up the truth. By my fourth day at the Pines, I stopped sitting by the window and staring blankly at the magnolia trees. Instead, I began to watch everything with the keen, practiced eye of a structural supervisor. I noted the precise rhythm of the nurse's footsteps on the linoleum, the metallic rattle of the medication carts at 6 a.m, and the hushed, urgent whispers that traveled down the hallway late at night. Every detail was a data point. I knew Ethan and Natalie would not be satisfied with just tucking me away in a quiet corner of Georgia. To fully seize control of $1.3 million without the authorities asking questions, they needed me to actually become the person they claimed I was. They needed me to lose my mind, or at least look like I had. That afternoon, Natalie came to visit. She didn't come alone. She brought a massive bouquet of lilies. She knew very well that I have been allergic to them for 40 years, yet she placed them right on my bedside table with a flourish. She wore a smile so artificial it made my stomach turn. The kind of smile you see on a predatory real estate agent. She sat on the edge of my bed and took my hand in hers, her grip cold and dry. She spoke in a voice of deep, rehearsed sadness, telling me to just rest and not worry about a thing. She told me that Ethan and her were already handling the house. She said the old place was just too large and dangerous for a woman in my condition, and they were thinking of turning it over to a young family who could appreciate it. Turning it over. That was her delicate, suburban way of saying they were preparing to sell my memories to the highest bidder before the month was out. I looked deep into her eyes, keeping my own voice just shaky enough to be convincing as I asked about my things and my husband's engineering blueprints. She waved her hand dismissively as if she were swatting a fly, telling me not to worry about that old trash. She then mentioned that the doctor thought I needed a new medication regimen to help stabilize my mood and keep me from being so confused. Natalie did not leave the building immediately after she walked out of my room. What she did not know was that Jake had recently updated the security system in this wing, and I was watching her every move through the laptop Jake had secretly left with me. On the screen, I saw her standing in a secluded corner of the hallway with a resident doctor I had never seen before. Thanks to Nurse Rose, a kind woman who had realized within 5 minutes of meeting me that I was perfectly lucid, I learned the bone-chilling truth of that conversation. Natalie had approached a junior resident and offered what she called a $5,000 support fee for his research. In exchange, she wanted me prescribed heavy sedatives, the kind of chemical restraints usually reserved for patients with advanced violent schizophrenia. She wanted to turn me into a dull, unthinking shell of a person. She needed me to be legally incapacitated so that when the time came to sign over the $500,000 commercial properties downtown, no judge would ever listen to my protest. But Natalie made the mistake of underestimating the people who actually work for a living. Nurse Rose and another staff member named Linda had grown suspicious of Natalie's frequent hushed phone calls in the facility garden. They managed to record a snippet of a conversation Natalie was having with Ethan while she thought she was alone near the azaleas. Natalie's voice sounded sharp and hungry on that recording. She told Ethan that the old woman should just die quickly and get it over with, so they didn't have to keep paying the facility fees. She said that as soon as they got the doctor to sign the papers declaring me incompetent, they would liquidate every remaining asset and move to Florida. She asked Ethan if he could already feel the sun on his face at the beachfront villa they were going to buy. Hearing those words made my chest tighten, not out of fear, but out of a pure and cold disgust. Florida villas bought with the blood and sweat of my 40-year career. They were planning to build their paradise on the foundation of my living grave. I clenched my fists under the thin hospital sheets, the engineer in me reminding me that once you identify a critical structural failure, you cannot afford to wait for the building to collapse. You have to act. While Natalie was busy playing the grieving daughter-in-law, Jake and Evan Shaw were working tirelessly in the background. Through Evan's connections in the Atlanta banking world, he had already secured copies of the checks Ethan had signed using my forged signature. Ethan had been using my money to pay off massive personal credit card debts and to fund Natalie's luxury shopping sprees at the high-end boutiques in Buckhead. Every forged check, every recorded whisper, and every statement from the staff here was being organized into a digital file that was as solid as a steel girder. I started keeping a journal of my own, hidden beneath the mattress. I didn't write about my feelings. I wrote about facts. I recorded the exact time of every meal, the names of every medication offered to me, and I even spent my afternoons solving complex structural calculus problems on the back of my menus to prove that my cognitive functions were superior to most people half my age. I was documenting my own sanity while they were trying to buy my madness. It was a race against time, but for the first time in years, I felt like the supervisor of my own life again. Late Saturday night, Jake stopped by my room and whispered that we finally had everything we needed. We had the evidence of the forgery, the proof of the attempted medical bribery, and the recordings of their intent to strip me of my dignity and my home. He asked if I wanted to call the police right then. I looked at myself in the small mirror above the sink. I saw an Annette Carter I had almost forgotten, a woman with eyes as sharp as a diamond-tipped drill. I told Jake to wait just a few more days. Ethan was scheduled to sign the final closing documents for the downtown building next Wednesday afternoon. That was when he would be at his most arrogant, believing he had finally crossed the finish line. I wanted the floor to drop out from under him at the exact moment he thought he was standing on top of the world. We spent the rest of the night reinforcing our legal scaffold. Every piece of evidence was a load-bearing beam, and every witness statement was a reinforced concrete pillar. Ethan and Natalie think they have me trapped in a small white room, but they have failed to notice that they are the ones who have been building their own cage. I am not a woman who seeks a messy or violent revenge. I am a builder, and when a structure is built on a foundation of lies and greed, It is only a matter of time before the weight of the truth brings the whole thing crashing down. I am going to let them put the final brick in place, and then I am going to pull the lever. My days at the Pines began to pass in a calculated, quiet rhythm that would have fooled any casual observer. I learned how to smile softly at the nurses when they brought my morning tea, how to finish every drop of the bland soup without complaint, and how to nod off in my chair at just the right moments to appear like a compliant, fading old woman. But beneath that silver-haired mask, my mind was a construction site operating at full capacity. I was mentally sorting the evidence Jake and Evan had gathered, checking the integrity of each fact as if I were inspecting the steel pillars of a bridge. Yet, despite the growing mountain of legal documents, there was a vast, hollow ache in the center of my chest. It was the specific, sharp pain of a grandmother who had been severed from the one person who gave her life meaning. I spent my nights wondering what Ethan had told Sarah. Did he tell her I was too sick to see her? Did my sweet girl believe that I had simply abandoned her without a word of goodbye? Late Saturday afternoon, as the long shadows of the Georgia pines stretched like dark fingers across the hallway, a slender figure appeared in the doorway of my room. She was wearing a faded University of Georgia hoodie, her natural curls pulled back into a messy bun, and her eyes were red and swollen from crying, yet they burned with a fierce, unmistakable clarity. She whispered the word Nana, and that single syllable was enough to bring down every wall I had spent a week building around my heart. It was Sarah. She had somehow managed to slip past the security desk with a little quiet help from Jake. I pulled her into my arms, and the familiar, comforting scent of vanilla and old library books that always clung to her hair made my own tears flow for the first time. I asked her how she had found me, since her father had told me she thought I was in Switzerland for a long overdue vacation. Sarah pulled back, her face a mask of grief and absolute fury. She told me that her father had lied to everyone. She said she had been suspicious from the very first night when Ethan refused to let her speak to me on the phone, claiming I was too tired or busy with tours. Being a psychology major, she knew when someone was overcompensating with a fake, cheerful narrative. She told me she had gone into his home office late at night and checked the GPS history on his car, seeing that he had made multiple trips to this specific address in the suburbs instead of driving toward the international airport. Sarah sat down beside me on the bed, her small hands gripping my weathered, calloused ones with a strength that surprised me. She began to recount the rot she had uncovered back at the house. She described the chilling, manic excitement in her mother Natalie's voice whenever she spoke about the beachfront villas in Florida and the new life they were about to start. Sarah whispered that she had found a carbon copy of the check from the Mercedes sale tucked away in a desk drawer, and her voice trembled with a deep, visceral disgust. But the final blow was when she discovered that Ethan had completely drained her 529 college savings account. He had wiped out the very future her grandfather and I had worked so hard to secure. Sarah realized they were planning to leave us both behind, discarding me in a facility and leaving her with no way to finish her degree, all to fund their own hollow luxury. The truth coming from her lips felt even more bitter than the numbers on a computer screen. Yet, as I looked at the young woman sitting before me, I saw a brilliant, resilient light. Ethan may have betrayed my blood, but I had not failed in raising my granddaughter. She didn't choose the promise of a wealthy inheritance. She chose the truth and her family. She told me not to be afraid and said she would be my eyes and ears inside the house. She promised to record their conversations and gather every document her father thought was hidden safely away. That afternoon, in that small room at the nursing home, a secret alliance was forged, that no amount of greed could break. It was more than just a lawyer or a facility director. It was the unbreakable bond between a 72-year-old grandmother and a 19-year-old girl. Sarah handed me a tiny, high-tech recording device she had bought with her own pocket money and told me to keep it hidden. She said if Natalie ever came back and tried to force me into taking those drugs, I should record every single word. I looked at her and saw my own reflection from 40 years ago, a woman who refused to bow down to injustice. The cold feeling of isolation that had been crushing me since my birthday suddenly vanished. I realized that while Ethan could forge my signature and steal my car, he could never touch the integrity and loyalty I had planted in Sarah's soul. We were no longer victims waiting for a blow to fall. With Sarah working from the inside and Jake and Evan guarding the perimeter, the structure of lies Ethan had built was already showing irreparable cracks. I smiled then, a real deep smile for the first time in a long time. I knew right then that this was a battle we simply could not lose. We just saw a beautiful moment of hope for Annette. When she felt she had lost everything, her granddaughter's love gave her strength again. Have your children or grandchildren ever been your greatest source of courage and wisdom? Share your story below, or leave a message for Annette and Sarah. Your words matter. The sound of Ethan's footsteps echoed down the long, sterile hallway of the Pines, heavy and rhythmic, like the thud of a pile driver on a morning job site. Each step felt like a weight pressing against the foundation of my composure, but I stayed still. Jake had warned me through the small burner phone just minutes before telling me to stay calm and reminding me that they were watching every move through the high-resolution cameras hidden in the ceiling. I took a long, deep breath, feeling the cool air of the facility fill my lungs, and I smoothed the fabric of my pale blue cardigan. I sat in the high-backed armchair with my back to the door, pretending to be lost in the view of the magnolia trees outside. My heart was thumping against my ribs with a ferocity I hadn't felt in years, but it wasn't the thumping of a victim anymore. It was the adrenaline of an engineer about to perform the most critical part of a controlled demolition. The precise moment when you pull the pins on a structure that has been rotting from within for far too long. I had to play my part perfectly. I had to be the fading, compliant mother he thought he had successfully discarded like a piece of outdated equipment. The heavy door creaked open and the room was suddenly filled with the scent of expensive sandalwood cologne, mixed with the faint acrid smell of stale cigarette smoke that always seemed to cling to Ethan's clothes. He didn't look like the monster who had dragged me here on my 72nd birthday. Today, he wore a new mask, one I had seen him wear at 100 different board meetings and charity galas. It was the mask of the dutiful, worried son. He set a glossy white bag from Whole Foods on my small bedside table, filled with organic fruit and expensive artisanal snacks that I knew he had only bought to create a scene of care for the nursing staff. He sat in the chair across from me, clutching a thick blue leather folder to his chest like a shield. He told me I looked better today, that the color was returning to my face. And then he immediately shifted the conversation to the engineering firm. He spoke about cash flow issues and the lingering effects of the post-pandemic economy, using a tone that was patronizingly gentle, as if he were explaining a complex concept to a small child. He pushed a set of legal documents toward me, telling me he needed my signature to finalize the transfer of the old commercial building downtown. He had the audacity to lean in close and whisper that this was for my own good, to ensure that the costs of my long-term care would be covered without me having to worry about a thing. I looked at him through eyes that I intentionally kept slightly unfocused, letting my hands tremble just enough as I reached out to touch the edge of the crisp white paper. I asked him about his father's building, the one we had spent 20 years paying off, and the one we had promised would always be the bedrock of Sarah's inheritance. I saw his right foot start to tap a frantic, nervous rhythm under the table, a habit he had developed as a young boy whenever he was trying to hide a broken window or a failing grade. He grew impatient, his voice sharpening as he told me that Sarah was still young and didn't understand the complexities of real estate. He told me to just sign the line and stop overthinking things. I picked up the heavy gold pen he offered, turning it slowly in my fingers, like a surveyor examining a piece of faulty equipment. I asked him if Sarah had called yesterday, mentioned how much I missed her voice. Ethan didn't even blink as he lied straight to my face, telling me that she was far too busy studying for her midterms in Switzerland and that the cell service in the mountains there was notoriously unreliable. If I hadn't been holding her in my arms just 24 hours earlier, listening to her cry about the betrayal she had uncovered, I might have actually believed him. I looked down at the document and saw the faint ghost of a pencil mark where he had already practiced forging my signature, a guide for him to trace over if I refused to cooperate. I looked up and asked about my Mercedes, telling him I wanted to take it for a drive on the upcoming Sunday to see the flowers in the park. That was the exact point where the structure of his lies finally gave way. Ethan snapped, standing up so quickly that his heavy chair screeched against the linoleum floor with a sound that made my skin crawl. He raised his voice, his face turning a dark mottled red, as he told me the car was old and unsafe, and that he had already been forced to sell it to settle the mountain of debts my medical care was supposedly creating. He started pacing the small room, shouting about the immense pressure he was under and how ungrateful I was being after everything he had done to secure this room for me. He told me to sign the damn papers and stop acting like a confused old woman who didn't know what day of the week it was. The mask of the loving son was gone, completely replaced by the desperate, predatory face of a man who had backed himself into a corner of his own making. I set the pen down on the table with a slow, deliberate click. All the anxiety and the fluttering in my stomach simply evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity that was as sharp as a diamond-tipped drill. I looked him straight in the eye and asked him exactly how much he planned to pocket from the sale of that downtown building, or if $500,000 was even enough to cover the $48,000 he had already drained from his own daughter's college savings fund. Ethan froze mid-step. The color drained from his face so quickly it was as if a valve had been opened, leaving him a sickly pale gray. He started to stammer, his hands shaking as he reached for the folder, trying to tell me that I was having another episode and that the doctors were right about my memory failing. I stood up then, letting the full height and authority of my decades as a chief engineer return to my posture. I told him in a voice that was low and steady that I wasn't having an episode, and I wasn't confused at all. I told him I knew about the heavy sedatives Natalie had tried to bribe the junior resident to prescribe for me. I told him I knew about the beachfront villa they were eyeing in Florida, and every single forged check he had cashed at the bank in Buckhead. I told him he had made the fatal mistake of thinking that, because he could take away my phone and my car, he could take away the mind that had built the very world he was trying to dismantle. I told him I had seen every single crack in his filthy plan from the very moment he drove me to those iron gates on my birthday. He backed away from me until he hit the arm of the chair, his eyes darting around the small room like a trapped animal looking for an exit. He tried one last desperate play, shouting that I had no proof and that no court in the state of Georgia would ever take the word of a woman with a documented diagnosis of Alzheimer's over his own. I smiled at him then, a smile that was full of a mother's deep sorrow, but reinforced with the strength of reinforced steel. I told him to say hello to Jake and to our family lawyer, Evan Shaw, because they were listening to every single word of this confession through the speaker system he had been too arrogant to notice. I told him that Sarah was listening too, and that she was currently at the house packing her things and recording his wife as we spoke. At that exact moment, the door swung open and Jake walked in, followed by two somber security guards. Ethan's entire world collapsed in an instant. He wasn't the powerful CEO of an engineering firm anymore. He was just a caught thief standing in a room he could no longer escape. He even tried to drop to his knees, reaching for the hem of my cardigan and starting to cry, saying he only did it because the firm was failing and he was in trouble. But I moved away before he could touch me. I turned my back on him and walked to the window, looking out at the magnolia garden where the white petals were beginning to fall like snow. I told him not to call me his mother because the man I raised died the moment he called me trash and decided that my life was worth less than a beachfront property. I told him that the truth was going to be the thing that finally swept away the rot he had allowed to grow in his heart. As the security guards led him out of the room to face the legal reality waiting for him in Jake's office, I sat back down in my chair. I felt a surge of strength moving through my spine, a feeling of absolute and total control that I hadn't felt since my husband passed away. I had protected the legacy we built together, I had secured Sarah's future, and most importantly, I had reclaimed my own dignity. I picked up the small burner phone and sent a short, simple message to my granddaughter telling her that it was over and that we had won. A single hot tear rolled down my cheek and fell onto my hand. But it wasn't a tear of weakness or regret. It was the feeling of a heavy weight being lifted and a foundation finally being set right. Tonight, for the first time since I arrived at the Pines, I was going to sleep with the peace of a woman who was truly free. As the sound of Ethan's heavy footsteps finally faded into the distance and the thick silence of the facility settled over the room like a heavy blanket, I felt a bone-deep weariness wash over me. That mental and emotional chess match had drained the last bit of strength from my 72-year-old body. I sank into the worn armchair and let my head rest against the back. My fingers were trembling as they instinctively reached for the thin gold band on my left hand. It was my wedding ring, its edges worn smooth by 50 years of life and love, and it was the one thing Ethan hadn't managed to strip from me. In the dim shadows of the evening, I closed my eyes, and for a fleeting moment, I could almost swear I smelled the scent of pine wood and the faint metallic tang of motor oil that always clung to Samuel's work jacket. Samuel, my husband, was a true Georgia man with calloused hands and a heart that was as warm as a summer afternoon in Savannah. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift back to the early days when we were just starting out. I remembered the long, humid evenings we spent sitting on the porch of our first house together, eating warm pieces of cornbread and poring over a mountain of technical blueprints by the light of a single lamp. Samuel would always place his hand on my shoulder and tell me that a sturdy bridge was not just held up by concrete and steel. He used to say that it relied on the integrity of the person who laid the foundation. He warned me that if the foundation was built on a lie, it would eventually buckle and collapse under its own weight, no matter how beautiful it looked on the outside. We spent our entire lives building more than just physical structures. We were building the honor of the Carter family name. Samuel worked until his very last breath to make sure Ethan had every advantage and to ensure that our granddaughter Sarah would never have to worry about her future. He trusted me to be the keeper of those values. I looked at the old photo that Jake had managed to slip into my room earlier. It showed Samuel with a young Ethan sitting high on his shoulders, and both of them were laughing with such pure joy. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. I wondered how Samuel would feel if he knew the son he adored had called me trash and tried to drug me into silence. I wondered if he could see how Ethan had drained the very funds we set aside for his own daughter's education. But in that sharp sting of grief, I finally found the answer I had been looking for. I realized that I was not fighting this battle to punish my son or to seek revenge for his cruelty. I was fighting to protect everything Samuel had lived and died for. I could not allow Ethan's greed to grind the kindness and the legacy we built into the dust. A strange and sudden peace began to radiate through my chest. I took a long, deep breath and felt as though Samuel were standing right there behind my chair, telling me I was doing the right thing and urging me not to give up. I looked out the window at the Georgia sky and noticed that the stars seemed to be burning a little brighter tonight. I no longer felt like a discarded old woman locked away in a room. I was the guardian of the Carter legacy. My strength was no longer just for Sarah, but for the memory of the man I loved. Tomorrow, the legal battle in court begins, and I will walk into that room with the steady heart of an engineer who knows her foundation is built on the truth. I am ready to clear away the wreckage Ethan has made and build a future for Sarah that is as solid as a mountain. Monday morning in Georgia brought a sky so blue it looked like a fresh coat of paint on a new house. But inside, Jake's the small office, the air felt thick and heavy like the humid breath of a storm before it breaks. I sat across from Evan Shaw, a man who had been the quiet guardian of our family's secrets and assets for over 2 decades. On the mahogany desk between us sat several thick manila folders, their edges worn from being handled, and their contents holding the weight of a lifetime. These were not just papers to me. They were the cold, clinical evidence of my own son's betrayal, organized and indexed with a precision that would have made any structural engineer proud. The realization that my own flesh and blood had tried to legally erase me from existence felt like a physical blow to my chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. But every time the pain threatened to pull me under, I heard Samuel's voice in my head. He always said a foundation built on lies would eventually buckle under the weight of the truth, and I knew it was finally time for me to be the one to give it that final push toward the ground. Evan reached across the desk and slid a folder with a bright red confidential stamp toward me, his movement slow and deliberate. He told me they had finally secured a copy of the petition Ethan had filed for a conservatorship. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I read the words my son had used to describe me to a judge. He had used a medical certification from a doctor I had never met, claiming I was suffering from early-onset Alzheimer's with a history of violent and unpredictable behavior. It was the ultimate irony for a woman who had spent 40 years calculating structural loads and managing multi-million-dollar projects to be branded as a woman who could not be trusted to manage her own life. But then Evan gave me a small professional smile and told me the good news. They had run an extensive background check on the doctor who signed that paper. It turned out the man had been stripped of his medical license 2 years ago for massive insurance fraud in another state. Ethan's attempt to use a fraudulent document to strip me of my freedom was now a serious criminal offense in the state of Georgia, and Evan was already preparing the paperwork to have the conservatorship vacated immediately. Then we moved on to the financial records, which felt like looking at a blueprint of a building that had been sabotaged from within. Evan showed me a report from a forensic document examiner who had spent the entire weekend comparing my real signature to the ones on the recent bank transfers Ethan had initiated. On the screen of his laptop, I saw the magnified lines of the forged signatures, and even to my eyes, the rhythm was all wrong. There was a visible hesitation in the ink, a lack of the natural flow that comes with a signature you have written 10,000 times over half a century. Evan explained that they had already sent an emergency legal order to Sun Trust Bank to freeze every single account in my name and all the shared Carter family assets. Every move Ethan was trying to make, including the pending sale of the downtown engineering building, was now at a dead standstill. I felt the initial sense of powerlessness start to melt away, replaced by the cold, steady resolve of a builder reinforcing a failing wall. I told Evan I wanted Ethan to face the full weight of every single check he had forged, not because I cared about the money, but because he needed to learn that his father's honor was not something he could pawn off to feed his own greed. Jake leaned forward and pressed play on a small digital recorder on his desk. He told me it was a recording from the security system near the parking lot that Nurse Rose had managed to flag for us. It was a conversation between Natalie and Ethan from just the night before, and hearing their voices made my skin crawl. Natalie's voice sounded sharp and full of a desperate kind of urgency as she told Ethan they needed to move faster. She said they just needed to get me to take a few more doses of the sedatives, so I would not be able to string a coherent sentence together when the court hearing finally came around. She actually suggested that if I looked drugged enough, the judge would have no choice but to hand over the keys to the estate. The sheer malice in her voice was a revelation to me. They did not just want my money. They wanted to neutralize my very humanity and turn me into a ghost while I was still breathing. Evan looked at me with a look of deep sympathy, but his eyes remained as hard as flint. He told me we were not just going to win a civil lawsuit. He said what they had done fell under the most serious level of elder abuse, and he intended to take the entire file to the district attorney's office. He said it was time for the law to speak for me since they had tried so hard to keep me silent. I took a long, slow breath, and for the first time in a week, I felt the weight of the world shifting back into my own hands. I was no longer a victim trapped in a nightmare. I was a woman with a clear plan and a team of loyal people standing beside me in the light. I told Evan to move forward with everything, and I told him I was ready to stand in a courtroom and testify against them both. I wanted the whole world to see that Annette Carter was still here and still perfectly capable of defending the legacy Samuel had left behind. Ethan and Natalie needed a hard lesson in what happens when you trade your integrity for a quick profit, and if the legal system was going to be their teacher, I was more than happy to help provide the curriculum. I felt a sense of calm returning to my spirit, as if I were finally standing on solid ground again. We just heard Annette take brave steps toward truth and justice. When family causes the deepest pain, do you still believe the law and honesty can protect our seniors? Have you seen justice defeat greed in your life or community? Share your thoughts below. Your voice and encouragement truly matter. That morning, the Fulton County Courthouse rose up in the heart of Atlanta with an air of solemn authority. I sat in the back row of the gallery, flanked by Jake and Sarah, my weathered hands clasped tightly in my lap. The navy blue suit Sarah had secretly brought to me at the facility still carried the faint, comforting scent of the lavender laundry detergent I had used at home for years. I took a long, steadying breath, feeling the crisp, sterile chill of the central air conditioning seep into my skin. All the preparation we had done, every piece of evidence we had meticulously gathered in that small room at the Pines, was now contained within the thick leather briefcase on Evan Shaw's table. I was no longer a discarded mother or a patient in a locked ward. I was a citizen, an engineer, and a woman standing on the threshold of reclaiming her own life. The heavy double doors of the courtroom swung open, and Ethan and Natalie walked in, looking as polished and untouchable as they always did. Ethan wore one of his most expensive tailored suits, carrying a designer briefcase and wearing the practiced expression of a successful businessman deeply concerned for his ailing mother. Natalie was dressed in a conservative, soft gray dress with her hair pulled back, her face a mask of calculated innocence designed to evoke sympathy. But as they walked toward their table and saw me sitting there, back straight, eyes clear, and spirit unbroken, I saw Ethan's stride falter for a fraction of a second. He quickly looked away, avoiding my gaze, while Natalie's hand tightened visibly around the strap of her handbag. They still believed their forged diagnosis was an impenetrable shield, but they had forgotten that the truth carries a weight that no amount of artifice can support for long. Judge Miller, a woman with eyes that seemed to see through every layer of pretense, began the hearing by addressing me directly. She asked if I understood why we were gathered there that day. I stood up, my voice ringing out through the quiet room with a clarity that had no room for a tremor. I told her that I was there to request the immediate vacation of an illegal conservatorship. I told her I was 72 years old, a retired structural engineer who had spent 40 years ensuring the safety of the public. I explained that I could describe the precise load-bearing calculations for the Peachtree Street Bridge I helped design, just as easily as I could recount every single financial transaction in my retirement accounts before my phone was taken from me. I began to list the timeline of events with a methodical precision, from the moment I was lured away on my birthday to the smallest details of the conversations I had overheard. My mind felt like a well-built structure, solid and transparent, leaving no dark corners for Ethan's lies to hide in. Evan Shaw stepped forward then, his voice warm but carrying the undeniable authority of a man who serves the truth. He did not use harsh or aggressive language. He simply let the evidence speak for itself. He projected the forensic analysis of the forged checks onto a large screen for the court to see. The examiner pointed out the unnatural hesitation and the mechanical rhythm of the signatures that Ethan had tried to pass off as mine. Evan explained that this was not a simple misunderstanding, but a systematic attempt to dismantle a woman's life for profit. He then presented the evidence regarding the disgraced doctor who had signed the medical certification, proving the man had no legal standing to diagnose anyone. Natalie kept her head down, her face pale, as the recording of her attempting to bribe a resident for heavy sedatives was played for the room. The courtroom fell into a profound silence. The cruelty was laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights, and there were no words left to justify their claims of caring for me. The most emotional moment came when Sarah stood up to testify. She did not look at her parents. Instead, she looked directly at the judge. Her voice was thick with emotion, but remained remarkably firm as she spoke about the integrity I had spent her whole life teaching her. She told the court how she wanted to believe her father when he said I was away on vacation. But her heart told her something was deeply wrong. She described finding me in a locked room, stripped of even my late husband's watch. She spoke about the betrayal of her own college fund and how her parents had lied to both of us to fund their own luxury. Seeing the daughter he had once doted on stand up for justice seemed to finally break Ethan. The arrogant facade of a CEO vanished, leaving behind a man who looked small and frightened by the consequences of his own choices. Judge Miller closed the file in front of her, her expression grave as she looked toward the defense table. She stated that the legal system in Georgia exists to protect people like me, not to be used as a tool for the greed of others. She declared an immediate stay on the conservatorship and ordered all my assets to be frozen under the direct supervision of the court and Evan Shaw until the final transition was complete. As the hearing adjourned and I walked out of that courtroom, the air outside felt lighter than it had in years. I didn't feel the heat of a victor or the hunger for revenge. I felt the profound peace of a builder who has finally repaired a crumbling foundation. I took Sarah's hand and nodded to Jake, knowing that while the road to full recovery would take time, The light of the truth was finally leading the way. On that final day at the Fulton County Courthouse, I didn't feel the biting chill of the central air conditioning or the suffocating weight of the legal procedures that had dominated my life for weeks. Instead, I sat beside Evan Shaw and felt the warmth of the Georgia sun streaming through the high, arched windows, casting long golden rectangles across the polished wood of the defense table. Behind me sat Sarah and Jake, my two steady pillars who had held up my sky when it threatened to collapse. I glanced over at Ethan. He sat with his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. Gone was the arrogant, high-powered executive. In his place was a man who looked like he was finally beginning to realize that the structure he had built on a foundation of greed was not just failing me, it was crushing him too. I realized then that the truth wasn't just about my freedom. It was about stripping away the toxic layers of deception that had poisoned my son's soul. The room fell into a deep silence as Judge Miller entered. Her presence always commanded respect, but today it felt like the very air was charged with the gravity of justice. She took her seat and began to speak in a voice that was slow and steady, like the rhythmic strike of a hammer on a job site. She stated that based on the undeniable evidence of forgery, financial exploitation, and the calculated attempt to harm a senior citizen's health, the court was issuing its final orders. She declared all of Ethan's powers of attorney and any legal authority he claimed over my life and assets to be null and void. She ordered Ethan and Natalie to pay full restitution for every cent they had misappropriated and placed them under the immediate supervision of the authorities. Judge Miller paused for a long moment, looking directly at Ethan with a look that was both stern and deeply disappointed. She told him that his actions were not just a violation of Georgia law, but a profound betrayal of the most sacred family bonds. For the crimes of forgery and financial abuse, she sentenced Ethan to 2 years of probation and 1,000 hours of mandatory community service at various local senior care facilities. She said he needed to see the faces of the people he had considered disposable. For Natalie, who had orchestrated the medical bribery and the attempt to physically incapacitate me, the judge was less lenient. Natalie was sentenced to 1 year in prison for her role in the conspiracy. As the handcuffs clicked around Natalie's wrists and she sank to her knees with a choked sob, I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I only felt a massive mountain-sized weight being lifted from my chest. I felt a sense of relief so profound it made my eyes sting. The restoration of my life began almost immediately. Evan informed the court that the bank had already finalized the paperwork to restore Sarah's 529 college fund. The downtown commercial building and my family home were now fully protected from any attempt at a forced sale. Sarah leaned over and whispered that she could finally go back to school, her voice thick with happy tears as she hugged me tightly. I felt her tears soak into the shoulder of my suit, and I thanked Samuel in my heart for giving me the strength to protect our granddaughter's future. The police had even managed to recover my Mercedes and my husband's heirloom watch, which they returned to me right after the session ended. As I slid the watch back onto my wrist, the cool metal felt like a warm embrace from Samuel, a silent promise that everything was going to be all right. Before we left the courtroom, I asked Evan to present a specific document I had spent the last few nights drafting. It was my new will, but it wasn't a document of revenge. I told the judge that while I was removing Ethan's current inheritance rights, I was including what I called a redemption clause. I explained that if Ethan successfully completed his sentence, participated in mandatory counseling, and showed genuine remorse through his work at the senior centers, a portion of the estate would eventually be returned to him in the form of a supervised trust. I told the court that I did not want to punish my son with poverty, but I wanted to teach him how to be a man of integrity again, the kind of man his father would have been proud of. Ethan looked up at me then, his eyes red and brimming with tears, and he gave me a small, shaky nod. It was a silent promise, the first honest thing I had seen from him in years. Jake drove me home that afternoon. As the car turned onto the small, pine-shaded road leading to my house, my heart began to race with a joy I hadn't felt since I was a young woman. There it was, my home, with its wide front porch and the rose bushes Samuel had planted so carefully. I stepped out of the car and took a long, deep breath of the air, which smelled of fresh cut grass and the damp earth after a light Georgia rain. There was no scent of antiseptic here, no sound of heavy iron gates locking behind me. I opened the front door and stepped into the entryway. The kitchen still held the faint, lingering memory of the smell of pancakes from that birthday morning, a reminder of where the nightmare began and where it was finally ending. Sarah helped me brew a pot of Earl Grey tea, and we took our cups out to the porch. We sat in the old wicker chairs, watching the sparrows hop across the green lawn in the late afternoon light. Sarah asked me what I was going to do now that I was finally free. I smiled and looked out toward the horizon, feeling the peace of the sunset settle over my soul. I told her I was going to live. I told her I was going to travel to the national parks Samuel and I always talked about, see the bridges and structures I had never had the chance to visit, and that I would wait patiently for the day her father returned to us as a decent man. I took a sip of my tea and felt a sense of absolute serenity. I realized that freedom isn't just about being out of a facility. It is about the soul being released from the weight of hatred and resentment. I have built many bridges in my long career, but the bridge leading back to forgiveness and peace is truly the greatest structure I have ever completed. 6 months have drifted by since the day I walked down those courthouse steps with a piece of paper that finally gave me back my name. My life these days is no longer measured by the cold precision of structural blueprints or the frantic dance of financial spreadsheets. Instead, it is measured by the gentle rhythm of late afternoons on my front porch here in Georgia. My world has shifted, and it is not because my bank account is full again, but because I have finally discovered a new foundation for the house of my soul. This one is not built on mortar or money, but on a simple, quiet sincerity. It is a warm Sunday afternoon, and the smell of slow-cooked barbecue is drifting through the yard. Sarah is over there laughing with a group of her college friends, and she looks absolutely radiant in her graduation gown. Jake is sitting right here beside me, and we are both enjoying a tall glass of that classic Southern sweet tea we both love. Just this morning, I received a letter from Ethan. He is finishing up his final month of community service at a public nursing home down in Savannah. For the first time in as long as I can remember, he did not write a single word about the engineering firm or the inheritance. He told me a story about an old man he has been caring for, and he said he is finally starting to realize that every single person has a story worth honoring. He wrote that he is finally learning how to be a human being. A single tear fell onto the paper as I read those words, but this time, it was a tear of real hope. I know his road to redemption is long and winding, but at least the deepest crack in our family has finally started to heal. My dear friends, the story of Annette Carter closes here, but I know its echo is still vibrating in all of our hearts. Looking back at her journey, I realized that family is not just about the blood running through our veins, but about the people who refuse to leave your side when the rest of the world turns its back. Annette did not choose a path of bitter revenge. She chose a path of justice for the sake of education, and she chose a path of grace to keep a door open for her son. The greatest lesson I have learned from this resilient woman is that while money might buy a villa in Florida, only integrity and love can build a true home. To all of you women who have spent your lives sacrificing for your families, please remember that your value is not found in the assets you leave behind, but in the strength and the dignity you hold onto during the storms. You deserve to be respected and heard, and you deserve to live a life of total freedom. Before we say goodbye, I truly want to know how you feel after hearing this entire journey. What do you think about Annette's decision to include that redemption clause for her son? What is the biggest lesson you are taking away for your own life? Please share your thoughts in the comments, because every one of your perspectives is a beautiful piece of the puzzle that helps us all heal and grow stronger together. I am Casey, and thank you so much for listening. I wish you a peaceful evening filled with love, and I will see you in our next story.